Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the next episode or installment about religion. This one is going to be about mysticism, and I'm focusing on the Abrahamic religions because they're the most associated with mysticism in and of itself. The reason being is because in polytheistic religions, those were often considered mystery cults, and in most other established religions, there's not really like a hidden component. There's usually sort of tiers or levels to those belief systems, whereas in Abrahamism they sort of splintered off into like these underground movements or separate sects that don't really associate with the mainstream. So let's, I guess, start with the oldest of the bunch, and that would be Kabbalah. That is Jewish mysticism. And Jewish mysticism actually has a lot in common with modern neo-pagan movements. There's a pretty good parallel to be drawn, actually. This will probably make a lot of neo-pagans mad, but there's a lot in common with like New Age and Wicca and other neo-pagan movements and Kabbalah. A lot, actually. They're, in many respects, they're all left-hand paths, so they fixate more on the individual and their place in the universe rather than in the focus of a deity. And a lot of, if you look at like the medieval wizards and warlocks and sorcerers and whatnot, John Dee, Edward Kelly, later on down the line, Aleister Crowley, they all kind of were into that whole syncretism of Kabbalah, and it influenced their views tremendously. If I remember right, even Cagliostro, who was influenced by, I actually did a podcast episode on him. Why can't I think of his name? The vampire guy. Comte de Saint Germain. Yeah, and a lot of his works focused on Kabbalah. So, what exactly is sort of the basis? Well, as you probably already know, Judaism is a monotheistic belief system that may or may not have evolved from a polytheistic belief system. Well, in this case, creation is sort of a series of emanations from the Godhead. And in that sense, it has something that very clearly, some of you right now are probably thinking, well, that sounds like monism or pantheism. Very similar. It's more like, imagine a prism, and as it rotates in the light, you see different colors emanating from it. The colors themselves are not necessarily material like the prism is, but you're perceiving them as a result of the prism and the angle in which you're viewing it. Well, those are emanations of the Godhead, and they are listed in number called Sephiroth. And that you see this a lot in mainstream like film and novels and even video games. There's a lot of Sephiroth references. Even The Witcher, which really surprised me, had a few. And these different, I'm not going to go into detail about each one because that would turn this into a very long video. But every single one of them is sort of an emanation of divine light. And that's a very important thing. That's a common motif that you're going to see when we get into Christianity and Sufism, is divine light. The idea of divinity being manifest in the form of light. Obviously light plays a key role in every religion. It's something that illuminates, something that is positive. We're diurnal creatures, so we have a very positive view of light and the sun and the day and things like that. There's not a single culture that I can think of, top of my head, that reveres nighttime more than daytime. That would be very strange for a diurnal creature to develop that. Again, I keep stressing what is natural and spontaneous for people, because those are things that you're just going to see repeated throughout different cultures, and it becomes manifest in different religions. And additionally, I don't think that the two have direct connections, but for some reason, tarot seems to draw heavily on the Sephiroth and on those emanations. I find that strange because I don't believe that it had like a common origin with that. I think that they just sort of evolved separately, and then sort of culture dictated that the two would have something in common. Yeah, weird stuff. And there's a lot of focus in Kabbalah on numbers adding up to be certain things, and it's almost bureaucratic in a way that would actually make Catholicism blush. You've got different ranks of angels and which of the Sephiroth that they are connected to, and which archangel or archangel, depending on your pronunciation, they're connected to. It's very, very, bureaucratic sounds negative, but I mean it's just very hierarchical. The way that the numbers of things add up, the way that spellings of different names convey different things, there's a real emphasis on hierarchical structure of the universe, which goes hand in hand with, again, this idea that everything that you see is sort of I almost said physical manifestation of the Godhead, but it's really more like a light-based manifestation. I don't know if you could actually call that physical or not, given the questionable nature of light as both a particle and a wave, and that's, of course, something that they didn't really fully understand even then. I mean, it becomes very complicated. See, that's one of the reasons why I held off on mysticism for a while in this series, because explaining mysticism is actually quite difficult. Oh yeah, Eliphas Levi. That was another medieval occultist, another medieval magus who was super into that sort of structure. So yeah, you see a lot of modern occultism stemming from Kabbalah, much more so than the other two I'm going to get into. You don't really see a big influence of like Christian mysticism regarding occultism at all, except for a few Gnostic elements, which I guess I'll make a video about Gnosticism eventually in this series. Anyway, let's move from there to Christian mysticism, because I don't want this to be too long of a video, and we're already 7 minutes in. Christian mysticism dates back to the Middle Ages. The biggest focus is a threefold path. And again, just like Kabbalah, it focuses more on the individual and their relationship to the divine rather than the orderly structure of the divine itself. So the threefold path is purification, illumination, and unification. And that's a very important thing. So you've got three elements to yourself. Capital S, very important. Soma, which is your body, just the spacesuit, as I've called it before. The soul, or psyche, which that corresponds really more to the mind than what we think of in modernity when we use the word soul. And then spirit, or pneuma, and that goes back even to both paganism and Judaism, actually. The idea that breath and life are the same thing, and that life, breath, and the spirit, the soul, that which animates the body and continues after the death of the body, it corresponds to breath. And so these three facets of humanity, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain that. They're not in sync, so you can kind of tie that in with like alchemy and both Eastern and Western. But the best way to get them in sync, the best way to become the idealized person, is to behave the way a traditional Christian would ordinarily behave. That's step one. Be disciplined, fast, pray, kneel when you pray. Because that's going to affect you. In some ways, you could draw a weird parallel between gestures in religion and what people do in secular modern times. I mean, look at correcting your posture and adopting a power posture to have higher confidence in, like, the sales world and things like that. Flipping Infinite Power by Tony Robbins. This emphasis on the postures that you adopt. Well, the same thing goes with purifying the body. Kneeling during prayer was very important because it puts you in a position where you're revering divinity over yourself, where you're not focused on the material world. Things like that. Other habits. Think of the things that a mainstream monk would do. An ascetic path. that's really goes hand in hand with purification. So that's a little more mainstream. Then it gets more interesting, and this is always how mysticism works. There are always tiers. You know, you've got the novices, and then you've got the initiates, and then you've got the adepts. That's how mysticism tends to work. Very similar to the mystery religions and paganism that I was talking about earlier. Okay, well now we've got illumination, and that is where the Holy Spirit enters the mind, the psyche, as I've said, and gives insight and truth about aspects of the Christian tradition that you couldn't get just through, say, reading Scripture or having a conversation with someone who studied it. No, I mean, this is where you get, you know, I keep using this phrase, plugged in. I don't know if I coined that or not, but it's something I say a lot. This is where you get plugged in. This is where the elements of reality that go well beyond ordinary perception start becoming part of your awareness. You begin to consider the universe and your place in it from a position that ordinary sensory perception would not allow. And then lastly, you've got unification, and that is where the spirit of the person unifies or unites with God and achieves a form of union. See how that has parallels with Kabbalah? See how mysticism differs from mainstream components of Abrahamism? No, we're getting more pantheistic and monistic. Again, this idea of uniting with God, not meeting God in heaven, but actually becoming a facet of divinity with a capital D. That's very different from mainstream Christianity. That being said, this is where it varies, though. This is where I wouldn't consider it to be pantheistic or monistic, is that this is an ideal. This is something that a person is attempting to do. It's not necessarily something that a person can do. It's very similar to the Western, which is heavily Christian, alchemy, where the goal is to perfect the self through a series of different trials. That's the real philosopher's stone, according to most alchemical sources. The idea of it actually being a stone is more allegorical. It's really more about perfecting the soul. So there are other different interpretations of this. It doesn't have to be a 3-stage path. It can be a 5-stage path. There's a series of meditational practices, like, for example, imagining God as a concept and just continuing to think that way, very similar to a Zen koan, in such a way that it starts to become manifest in your mind, and as such plugs you in to those insights. Very different, like I said, from mainstream. This is also where we get sort of the stereotype of self-flagellation. That was actually more common among mystics, and in movies they love to portray it like, oh yeah, your average Christian back then, they just whipped their back bloody. Not really. This was much more associated with mystics, and that's because mysticism is about shocking the self. I mean, really shocking you to make you open. So, creating a vacuum, so to speak, a spiritual vacuum that can be occupied by the divine. Just as nature abhors a vacuum, so does the spiritual world. And now, let's see, how many minutes have I done already? 13. Yeah, let's go ahead and move to Sufism. I love Sufism. I think it's a fascinating aspect of Islam and something that nobody talks about hardly. Like, I've never seen a documentary on them. You never hear about them, really, except every once in a while you'll hear about whirling dervishes. That's it. And they're fascinating. For starters, one of the big criticisms of Islam nowadays is that they don't really have much of a sense of humor about things. A lot of extremism. Sufis are way more chill. They actually have their own brand of irreverent, quasi-blasphemous jokes, actually. Like, I can remember one, an imam is preaching. That's like a priest or preacher equivalent in Islam, for those of you who don't know. The imam is preaching of the evils of alcohol, and he says, if I were to even tie a donkey to a post and let him go without drink for a day, and I give him a bucket of alcohol and a bucket of water, which one would he pick? And immediately there's a Sufi in the congregation. He raises his hand. He says, the water. And he says, that's exactly right. Why is that? And the Sufi raises his hand again. He says, because he's an ass. So, yeah, not a joke you'd probably hear in more mainstream circles, right? But yeah, Sufism is a little more irreverent. It takes a less serious approach, which that's another thing that you'll commonly see in mysticism, is because the focus is more on the individual, there's often a lot less respect for orthodoxy, a lot less respect for the rules that, the mainstream sects or belief systems associated with those religions have. And Sufism is certainly no different. And probably the biggest aspect of Sufism that separates itself from mainstream Islam would be al-insan al-kamil. Yeah, I had to write that down because that's not something I'm just going to bring up at the top of my head. That's not something I can remember too well because I don't speak Arabic. But that means the perfect man, and it's almost Nietzschean in its idea. It's very Ubermensch, and it's that it's weird. Every era of human existence, there's always going to be a pole or axis of the universe, and because there exists a pole of the universe, there's got to be a person who channels that pole, and that pole is comprised of God or Allah's grace, His divinity. Again, I keep saying divinity with a capital D, but it's very important in all religion, especially mysticism. It's the big focus. The focus isn't on God as an individual or as a lawbringer or an example or whatever, like most belief systems. It's God as an ethereal and esoteric force that's to be unified with, and so divinity with a capital D is very important in explaining that. And so as a result, there's kind of always sort of a Superman person, like a dude who's just in direct conflict with modern values, with I mean, I'm not trying to compare it to Hinduism, but this Kali Yuga fallen man idea, and this is kind of a big issue with Sufism. Sufism is a branch of Sunni Islam, and this goes directly against Shia. So this is one of the reasons why Sufi are often oppressed in Shia-dominated countries, by the way. It's one of a few reasons, really, but that's a big one, is their idea of there being this perfect man. It goes directly against the tenets of Shia, and it's a serious issue for them. Yeah. And they use a lot, again, like alchemy, like Kabbalah, like Christian mysticism, which unfortunately doesn't have a proper name. That kind of bothers me. Kabbalah is a proper name, Sufism is a proper name. Christian mysticism doesn't really have a word, but like those, it makes use of metaphors a lot. Everything has an exoteric interpretation and an esoteric interpretation, and that's a fundamental aspect of mysticism in general. They really go heavy on that. If a layman without the proper teaching were to read their texts or their teachings, would probably not understand it at all. And that's another actual important element of Sufism. Probably, in my opinion, the second most important, alongside the Superman idea or perfect man idea, is this notion that true understanding, like I was talking about with proper insight from the psyche being plugged in with Christian mysticism, true insight comes from divine light. See, there we go again, being passed from teacher to student. So you're not learning it the way you would learn to count or to read or taxonomy of different insects in West Virginia. You're learning it in a psychical manner. You're learning it because your teacher, because they've studied it so extensively from their teacher who studied it and so forth, manifests this divine light, and that's what enables you to understand. It's again another good word for it that sadly they don't actually use, but would be insight. Insight, this idea that you're plugging into something that you normally, using your ordinary senses and means of perception, wouldn't really be able to grasp. So I think that's really, it's a fundamental part of it. And now let's talk about whirling, because that's probably what people think of when they think of Sufism. really interesting thing. It's a ritual where they spin around a lot, and seeing it in and of itself, you think, okay, this is just a dance. This is just a metaphor. This is just symbolic. Not necessarily. By spinning and training themselves to do this, it's very similar, like I was talking about with the self-flagellation. You're sort of entering a receptive state. Again, I said earlier, you create a vacuum, a spiritual vacuum. Well, they spin, they listen to music, and they focus on Allah or God or whomever. Again, it gets, it's kind of open to interpretation once you're just dealing with translations of words, because they're different, but they're the same. Anyway, they're imitating the cosmology of the universe, the divine geometry of the universe. They're like planets orbiting stars, right? But by spinning and by teaching themselves not to be sick from spinning, and by focusing on the divine, and by listening to music, which often puts people in a trance-like state, they enter a state of mind that, like with the divine light in their teachings, plugs them into something else, gives them insight, gives them a connection to divinity that they wouldn't have without engaging in that ritual. And that's a huge part of mysticism too. Is in mainstream religions, rituals create a sense of sacred space and sacred time, and can have a huge, pronounced effect on a person's psyche. But with mysticism, they take it to another level. With mysticism, rituals don't exist to honor a deity or to bridge the gap between one class of person and another, which I'll get into later when I talk about liminal states and rites of passage, but rather to completely alter the individual, to empty the individual out of their ego and create room for like a seed of divinity to sprout and grow, and ultimately inoculate that person. Think about, you take something as base as soil and you put seeds in it, and something beautiful grows out of it. Like people make little references to, the fact that roses can grow in horse manure, right? That's sort of what mysticism is about. Mysticism is about changing the nature of a person so that the soil of their mind or soul can be inoculated with the roses of divinity, and it changes them. They become something else. They're not a pot of soil anymore, they're a pot of roses. I've gone way over. I didn't expect to talk this much about mysticism. I think that gives everybody some decent ideas to the different kinds in both in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So I hope that helps. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Thanks. See you guys.